Welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the Brennan Library's first book launch party featuring our own professor of graphic design, Ken Calhoun. His first novel, Black Moon, was released to rave reviews from reviewers such as Library Journal, Publishers Weekly, and NPR, to name only a few, and he's acquired many fans on Goodreads, some of whom are already asking, when is the sequel coming out? Here's what one reviewer has to say. Calhoun's parable about humanity distanced from the psychic sources of its own daily regeneration acquires another level of meaning. Civilization cannot exist without its dreamers. Lucky for us, we continue to have ones like Kenneth Calhoun doing the job so ably. Ken has been named a Barnes & Noble Discover Great Authors selection, and he's on the list of Real Simple Magazine's top 5 books to read this spring. This afternoon, Ken will read from Black Moon, he'll answer your questions, and he'll sign copies of his book. Lasell students are eligible for 3 free book drawings, and the basket is outside that first door. If you want to put your name in if you haven't done so already, and there's a light lunch available. And I'd like to thank the library staff members who planned this event, that's Jill Shoemaker and Elaine Rusharuda. Elaine designed the flyer, and Allison McCarter created the display that's in the Brennan Library lobby. If you haven't had a chance to see it, please stop by and do so. Thank you. Here is Ken Calhoun.
Thanks so much for actually organizing this. I want to thank all the librarians that you mentioned. It's good to be friendly with librarians when you're in the book business. But they're friendly people, so it's easy, It's not a stretch. I actually wanted to say a little bit about libraries, if I could, in my attempt to make this interesting. I just know that libraries are kind of, they seem like something that needs to be remembered in a way that reminds us of how vital they are. And I know that there are a lot of writers right now that are campaigning on behalf of libraries and communities because they're losing funding and they're struggling to make it happen. And I just think in this new kind of marketplace where we order things online and we have Netflix, sending us stuff, it's an interesting idea. I actually saw a tweet or a blog post by someone a few years ago that said, wouldn't it be a great thing if you could just go to some place and just borrow a book and then return it after you're done, so you don't, you can just. And people were like, there are libraries, right? And I honestly couldn't tell if this person was, being sarcastic or if they really did not know that such a thing exists. So I spent a lot of time in libraries when I was a kid and, did the summer reading and competing with my brother to see who could read the most books and spent a lot of time just hanging out in libraries. So I'm really happy to be a friend of the library world right now, especially since the library world has been so kind to the book. What I thought I would do is just read just some parts of the book, not like a whole piece, because I think that can get kind of long-winded. So I'm just going to read little snippets and kind of just actually try to give you an overview of the book and talk about the story. And then I hope people have some questions. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking about libraries. So, the book is about an insomnia epidemic, and it starts with a chapter where there's a couple who are people who have always had in their relationship this difference in sleep cycles. The male character, his name is Matthew Biggs, can always sleep, and the woman character struggles with sleep. And so when this insomnia epidemic hits, they kind of fall into these natural roles where she succumbs pretty quickly to it. And he finds himself to be strangely immune to it. So the first section I'll read is about this couple, and it's actually the first 3 pages of the book. This was originally appeared in 2008 or 9 in Readivider magazine at Emerson College. It was called Placebo, and it's changed quite a bit since it was first published. Take my glasses off for this. Biggs ran and burst down the street, wanting to move quickly, but without attracting attention. These dark blocks between their building and the ransacked drugstore were sketchy. He moved through the cold corridor of shade, relieved to find the streets empty, except for a few figures stumbling in the distance like drunks. At the intersection, abandoned cars were stalled in a mad jumble, and he had to squeeze through the gaps, pressed against the cool barriers of automotive gloss. Shops were shuttered. Many had been looted, windows smashed, and shelves inside empty. The sidewalk was gritty with shards of glass and spotted with ancient stains of chewing gum, a great splatter of DNA, blackened with urban grime. You could hear the distant wailing and the occasional shout or scream from the offices and apartments above. Protruding from one window 5 floors up, he saw an elderly man leaning far out over the street, teetering on the brink, his thin arms extended toward the sky. Beyond him, a few floors higher, someone was throwing fistfuls of paper from an open window. The sheets drifted and turned like leaves in the air, funneling between the buildings. Biggs crossed to the other side to avoid a stoop where earlier he had seen dogs tearing at an unidentifiable carcass, white bone shining through the marbled meat. He ducked down an alley. At the far end, a large woman in a Lakers jersey paced while shouting into her cell phone, "A lawsuit isn't wanted by you at all, believe me very fucking much." She warned, jowls quivering. When Biggs neared, he could see that she wasn't holding a phone. Even if she had one in hand, a phone call was an impossible feat. The sky was now without signals, the web of fibers dead in the earth, networks expiring without sound human minds needed to maintain them. The woman tracked Biggs with her bleary eyes as he shuffled past. "Wait one," she said into her palm. "Some asshole here like a rat." Half a block ahead, a flat-screen TV exploded on the pavement, tossed from several stories up. It fell like an obsidian slate, a tile of nighttime sky. He felt the impact in his teeth, the shatter in his chest. The storm was gathering behind the dark windows and closed doors. It could spill out into the streets at any moment. He jogged 2 blocks, keeping to the middle of the street before slowing to a walk. You could see the ruins of the drugstore now, on the other side of the park. His wife, Carolyn, was in bad shape. What was it now, 6 days? Almost a week without even a nod, her head always pedaling in place. She radiated exhaustion, a dying star. Soon, what? A black hole? Biggs had to take some kind of action, but before he did anything, he needed to clear his own head. In the effort to convince her that he too had succumbed to sleeplessness, he had deprived himself of any significant downtime. He had a plan that involved pills and some showmanship. But first, some quick sleep out of view was necessary. He went into the park and looked around before pushing into the shrubbery. They used to picnic here, blankets spread on the lawn, Carolyn rolling up her sleeves to get some sun on her shoulders. In the thicket, he found the place where only 2 days earlier he had created a nest of twigs and grass. Curling up inside, it wasn't long before his thoughts took on the lawlessness of sleep. Images and ideas now drifted, unmoored by reason. The heavier sleep soon fell over him like a rug, and he saw nothing. 2 hours later, he had a dream. Carolyn shining light into his eyes from a cluster of crystalline fractals she carried in her hands. He returned to the slowly imploding world, blinking at shards of the sun through the weave of saplings. He sat up, both astonished and relieved. Something inside him continued to hold firm. I still sleep and dream. So that's from the first chapter. There are a few characters in this book, and it kind of switches back and forth, which some people like and some people seem to hate. Yes, I've been on Goodreads. It's not all good news. But I'm a big boy. I can take it. This story, the next character is about this younger girl. She's a high school girl. Well, I guess she's like a freshman, I would say, maybe an 8th grader. Her name's Lila, apparently. I wrote the name L-I-L-A, and in my mind, the entire time I was thinking it was Leela. But everyone seems to say Lila, so I guess I'll switch. What would you say? Okay, so it's Lila. Let me try to make sure I don't mess that up. So she's a young girl who lives out in the California desert. Her father is a psychologist who works with Marines who are suffering from post-traumatic stress. And they're out there when the insomnia epidemic hits. And so she's starting to suspect that her parents can't sleep, but she still can. Lila pulled a blanket over herself in the back seat of the car. It wasn't cold in the dark garage, but she needed it as protection, as camouflage. Then, curled up, she did it without any problem, the thing that everyone was trying to do. Sleep was the summer craze, the must-have of the moment. She saw how it could be true, what her father had been saying about insomnia being real in some people and imagined in others. You worry so much about sleeping that you can't sleep. A self-fulfilling prophecy, he called it. It had this effect on her, but only to a point. The exhaustion simply took over, and she saw in the pre-REM flashes the rusted post, the hawk's safe roost, and the aqueduct quickly approaching. She was sliding toward it on the raft. She knew she had to grab it and readied herself. She can do it, her mother seemed to say. Through the door, she heard her father say something low and calm, but Lila couldn't make out the exact words. She's doing it under the bed, her mother insisted after a long silence, and I bet that's what she's doing in the car. Lila heard them talking in bed right before she opened the door, their voices sawing like stringed instruments through the wall. His low friction of worry, her high pluck of anger. Then there they were, still as statues, pretenders, eyes closed, flopped back on pillows with the pale green sheets pulled up. She went to her mother's side and looked at her face, examining the stillness for signs that she was there, awake, under the surface. She was beautiful like this, Lila thought, admiring the full lips, the smooth contours around the eyes, the swelled cheekbones. And her dad, his face almost unrecognizable without the worried creases. They both looked younger this way, even if they're faking it. Nice touch with the open mouth. Dad, maybe I should drop a coin in there. What kind of song would I get? Maybe it was now let's switch to the dad's perspective. Maybe it was the hurricane upsetting a sealed storehouse of voodoo Dr. Farrell considered as his daughter hovered over them. He distracted himself with his ongoing mantra of maybes. So this is a character who's trying to figure out what caused this, and he is just at a loss. Maybe it was the toxic dust from fallen towers, the ash creeping into our lungs. Maybe it was some ancient spore released by the melting ice. Maybe it was the earthquakes and the tsunamis they summoned. Maybe it was the hole in the ozone, the collapse of the upper atmosphere. Maybe it was the betrayal by the banks. Maybe it was the dead surpassing the living. Maybe it was the ground choking on garbage and waste. Maybe it was the oil blasting freely into the ocean or the methane thawing at the bottom of the sea. Maybe it was the overload of information, the swarms of data generated by every human gesture. Maybe it was the networking craze, the resurrection of dead friendships and memories meant to be lost, now resurfacing like rusted shipwrecks to reclaim our attention and scramble our sense of time. Pretty cheery, huh? Could have been any one of those things. All right, so that's those characters. They're, a family that's caught up in this. And then I wanted to read from a section where there are some actual scientists on the case, and they're trying to research and trying to come up with a solution in a sleep research center in something that sounds a lot like San Diego, a lot like the University of California, San Diego, for some reason. So they're working on it, and they're led by a Russian researcher named Kitov. Vladimir here? Damn it. All right, I'm not even going to try a Russian accent. If you could leave for a little bit. Okay, but this chapter is really about this character named Felicia, who is one of the central characters, and she was a student worker at this lab when the insomnia epidemic hit. So she's a research assistant. And they feel like they've come up with a solution for the sleep, and that is to put an implant in the brain that triggers instantaneous sleep. Now, the problem they find with this later is that, well, I won't say yet. To gear up for the procedure, they had been looting equipment from the university's abandoned hospital, cobbling together an operating room in the main lab of the research facility. They were concerned about electricity, even though all the research facilities were powered by an experimental system that tapped wave movement and riptides. The turbines, which sat just under the surface among the kelp beds, were revealed every day by the receding tide. The elegant electromagnetic system had earned its inventor a Nobel Prize nomination, even though it had never been adopted as a viable alternative energy solution anywhere beyond the research wing of the campus. Kitov had very publicly despised the late Frenchman who created the wave-powered plant and had abused his famous colleague at every opportunity. Now, as they shaved the back of his head, he joked that the plant would fail during the procedure, and that bastard Cloutier will have the last laugh, he grumbled, his words slurred. They enclosed Kitov's head inside a metal frame, locking it into position with pins that bored into his skull. Felicia, who had mastered the use of a syringe when injecting countless rats and dogs for Lee's research, was recruited to administer the local anesthetic at 4 points where the pins penetrated the scientist's papery skin. He winced when the needle went in, telling her that she was Queen Bee, who, unlike the drones, can sting repeatedly with no fear of death. The moment had summoned enough adrenaline to override her exhaustion and steady her hand. She numbed the top of his head too at the drill points and then stood back. There would be no more anesthesia, local or general, since the brain itself does not feel pain. Lee and Porter moved in, locking the electrode driver into the frame. The driver would ease the electrodes with precision and steadiness of the machine. Normally, its movements would be largely automated, informed by calculations made from computer analysis of MRI and tomography scans. But no one remaining at the center knew how to get the driver and the computer to talk to each other, not in real time. So the task fell upon Lee, whose machine-like comportment seemed a good fit. For guidance, he would listen to the firing of nerve cells, which were picked up by the electrode and amplified. He would also ask Kitov to count or list animals or raise his arms in order to determine the location of the implant as it traveled to its destination. There was some blood when they drilled, even though they had flapped a scalp. Felicia was ready with gauze, quickly sponging off the area. The drill's high-pitched whine filled the room. A wisp rose from the contact point, and Felicia couldn't tell whether the mist was from the coolant, the liquid coolant of the drill, or bone dust. Before long, there were 2 nickel-sized pieces of skull in the tray and 2 openings like a peephole for each eye in Kitov's skull. They could see his brains under the light, a slick, pale coil of fat worms, thinly stained red. "And so," Kitov asked sportingly, "what do you see? My child is there, my Vera there, on a bench by the river. See how we found so many mushrooms? I hurt my shoulder falling on the ice in front of the institute." "It's your head," Porter said, "not a view, master." Lee, from behind a surgical mask, glanced at Porter, then Felicia. Was Kitov delirious from lack of sleep or just giddily rhapsodic over clearing the first hurdle? He seemed to ask with his eyebrows, with his questioning pause. They did not answer. Instead, Porter asked Kitov if he was comfortable, and the old man laughed. "My face has been before trapped in tighter places. But yes, soft places." Lee sat and studied the driver monitor. With a small joystick, he lowered the recorder electrode lead so that it sat only in millimeters above the brain tissue. Then, with a nod to Porter, he edged the joystick forward, and the thin, stiff tendril of wire slid slowly between the wet convolutions with a faint electric hum. He paused. "All good?" he asked his patient. "Yes, of course," Kitov growled. "Start it already." "We have," Porter said with annoyance. These guys have been out without sleep for a long time, so they're kind of pissy. Now the hard, slow work began. Lee advanced the lead in micrometer increments, listening for the firing of nerve cells, which crackled like static until Felicia helped move Kitov's legs and arms. Then the waveform on the monitor spread across the screen like a dark stain, and the resulting firing of nerve cells was voiced with a loud, sustained creaking, a
the cathedral door slowly swinging open. Because they did not have the live scans of Kitoff's brain, Porter cross-checked the coordinates against the generic model of a 3D brain, a preset from the applications library. When they decided on the exact location, they swapped out the recording electrode for the actual pulse lead and again slowly advanced as Felicia monitored the EKG and observed Kitoff's response to Lee's tests. Extend the index finger of your right hand, tap your feet together for 5 minutes, look to the left, look to the right. This went on for 3 hours until, by all available calculations, they believed they had arrived at the proper placement of the electrode. You ready for some downtime? Lee asked Kitoff. When I see Hypnos, Kitoff responded, I will persuade him not to abandon us. Then, when Lee gave the nod and Porter manually triggered the sleep pulse, they watched as Kitoff's eyes dropped shut. They checked the EKG. The heart marched on. All three looked at one another, eyebrows raised. It seemed as though it had worked. They were removing their surgical mask when Felicia noticed the tremor in Kitoff's legs. They watched it move up his body, into his hands, into his chest, where it caused a flutter in his breathing. Then spasms hit, the body convulsing. Lee threw himself over his mentor, trying to prevent him from tearing out the pins on the stereotactic frame that caged his head. But Kitoff's body kicked and bucked, knocking over bedside machinery, the rolling tray of tools. Felicia screamed as Porter pushed her out of the way and tried to wrangle their patient's scissoring legs. The pins tore in Kitoff's head as he twisted. Minutes later, the celebrated scientist died behind a veil of blood. Cheery! One last little section, and then that's enough. I think probably. Maybe it already is enough. No, that's enough. No? One more section? All right, I'll read a strange part. I'll read a very strange part. There's one chapter in the middle that has characters that don't appear anywhere else in the book. They're just lost to this tide of sleeplessness that starts to overwhelm everyone. And they are parents of a newborn. And I read part of this. I read this, I guess, recently at the Newtonville bookstore. But there's one little story within a story that I think is kind of fun. I have no idea where it is in this book. Should have a table of contents. Here it is. So they have this baby, and sometimes they know where the baby is, and sometimes they don't know where the baby is. Sometimes the baby is like a normal baby, and sometimes it's not a normal baby. And sometimes the baby tells them stories. And here's one of the stories that the baby is telling the father, whose name is Adam. He's the brother of Biggs, the character in the first segment I read, who is sleeping in a nest. Then the baby told Adam a bedtime story into his chest. The words went through the sieve of skin and bone, leaving behind a pool of drool. The baby said, "Even though you had heard reports of the giant sparrow, you brought me to a certain park in the carriage. You and Mother had a picnic when the bird came down from the black trees and landed on the handlebar of the stroller. Its weight, because it was the size of a dodo, caused the stroller to spill forward, and I flew into the bird's beak. I was wailing into the sparrow's dry tongue, which smelled like fresh mud. The beak was locked down on me, solid as furniture. And in a tumble and roll, with a flapping like an umbrella opening again and again, we were aloft. Your shouts and Mother's screams were muffled and growing distant, but not gone. It took me up into the trees where it perched and tipped back its head, working me into the tight suitcase of its gullet. It was like being born into darkness. You and Mother hunted for us in the trees with your eyes, but the bird had roosted in the girding under a bridge, tucking its head under a wing. I was inside, refusing to be digested. I knew what to do, since the bird on the inside was not unlike Mother. I introduced a maddening nursery rhyme into the bird's tiny brain, preventing it from sleeping. Deprived of food and sleep, the bird became very susceptible, and it was then that I began a campaign of unreasonable suggestions. When the bird was weakened and the belts and tethers of its dark interior had gone slack, I assumed the role of pilot and puppeteer. I pulled sinews from the weave of its fleshy fabric, and using nubs of bone from digested animals as spools, built an array of pulleys that controlled the bird's every move, even after it had died. At the time, you knew nothing of this. The police couple that came to investigate were outraged by your claims. You were alternately persons of interest, then suspects. They separated you and lied about what the other had said, but you and Mother held firm, were not quaking with grief. You were with the police in the park with their cadaver dogs when the bird appeared above you, flying with the jerky movement of a marionette. I landed it in the grass with a tumble. The skin, which was now as dry as paper, tore upon impact, and I tumbled out, little fists curled around the bone handles and levers I had devised. Mother scooped me up and attacked the remains of the bird with her boots until I made it clear to her that the animal had died a long time ago. That's kind of a story within a story, within a story. So that's probably enough, right? So, just to kind of piece it all together, the story moves in these different fragments, focusing on a few different characters. The biggest character from the beginning, and Carolyn. And then there's a chapter with these two college-age guys named Jordan and Chase that I didn't read from. And then Lila and Felicia at the lab. And sometimes they cross over, and sometimes you just never hear from people again. And I think that aspect of it, the ambiguity of it, is interesting to me artistically, but I think some people find it a bit strange. But anyway, that's the book, Black Moon. Yes?
Could you share with us the process you went through in getting it published?
Oh, okay.
Finding an agent?
Sure.
And how long have you been working on it? Just so that from
Yeah.
the author's perspective,
Mm-hmm.
it's a wonderful accomplishment to have this published. I commend you for
Thank
it.
you.
And it would be, I think, interesting for the faculty and the students who are here to learn a little bit about what an author needs to go through in order to come to the point that you're at now, which is wonderful. Kudos to you.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I think what most people do is they write short stories. This is what I did. I went to college. I went to MFA program at Emerson. So I did study fiction as an undergrad and as a grad student at Emerson. And that's a good way to give yourself time to write. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll end up, being a writer. A lot of people I went to school with don't write. Even the graduate students, I don't know. They got caught up in life, So I wrote a lot of short stories, and I just sent them out. I sent them out, and they came back, and I just kept doing it. I finally started getting some stuff published with a little more frequency about 10 years ago. And I got these stories published in very small journals. Everything from, I mentioned Readivider, which is the big journal at Emerson is Plowshares, which is considered one of the more respectable journals in the world. But the graduate students create a journal called Readivider. I had stories published there. I have stories published in Fiction International, in St. Petersburg Review, in a local little magazine called Quick Fiction. And that's just how I lived. I just wrote stories and I sent them out, and they came back. I revised them and I sent them back out again, over and over and over. And it was mostly about rejection, the whole thing. But then the thing that you hope happens, it's like being in a band and having to play a lot of gigs at bars, and you hope one day someone comes in from the industry and they see you. This is the same kind of paying your dues type thing. I had a story published in a small journal called the St. Petersburg Review. It was their kind of debut issue. And then a year later, I was working at another institution as a professor, and I got in my mailbox a letter from the Paris Review. And the Paris Review is one of the most celebrated literary journals ever. And I just immediately assumed, because of my habits, that it was a rejection. But I hadn't sent anything to the Paris Review. Probably since, I don't even know if I ever sent anything to them. And anyway, I read it, and it was like 2 sentences. It was from the editor saying, "We saw your story, headlock, in the St. Petersburg Review, send us something." So I sent them a story. I got all excited, waved the letter around, sent them the story, and they sent it back. They rejected it. But they said, mostly when you send stories out, you get these like rejection notes that are just like, they're so insulting because it's not even a full page of paper. It's like they printed like 10 of them and then cut them up so they don't waste paper. And they send you like this thing this big. And this is back when you actually sent stuff through mail. You'd open this envelope and your story would be there. Like it didn't even look like anyone. You'd look at it closely for any kind of markings or maybe even like, some nacho cheese stain or something. Nothing. And then you would look at the bottom envelope, there's this little like ticket, and you'd read it and say, "Thanks so much, it just wasn't right for us, but please do try again." And that's usually what you get. Well, the Paris Review actually wrote me a letter that said, it wasn't, more words than that, but at least someone actually typed them out. It said, "We enjoyed reading this story, we passed it around, but we found that it wasn't right for us, but we strongly encourage you to send something else." And so I worked on another story. I had a writing group, this is in North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I sent them that story. And I waited and waited and waited. And it came back, and it was another rejection. And it said the same thing. "We really like this, it's cool, but it's not really the Paris Review." And I was in this writing group, and I was working on this other story that was kind of different from those stories, and it was more about, it's called Night Blooming, and it's about these old men who play Dixieland jazz, and this young punk drummer who gigs with them one night, and goes out with them, and they have a hell of a time. And I was working on that with this writing group, and finished it, and I sent it, and then 2 days later, I got, not a letter, I got an email saying that they were going to take it. And I was astonished. It was on my birthday when I got that email. And they did, they put it in. I went to Lithuania for a writing event, and I was in Vilnius in July, and people were telling me, I was getting emails from the US saying that it was in the Paris Review. And I was astonished. And they spelled my name wrong on the cover. They spelled Kenneth wrong. Not Calhoun, Kenneth. So I became Kenneth. That's what I go by now, but you just call me Ken. So anyway, that happened. This is a long story. And because it came out in the Paris Review, agents saw it. And so 2 or 3 or 4 agents contacted me and said, "It's great, what do you got?" And that's what agents say. And then when you say, "Oh, I just have a bunch of short stories," they're like, "Oh, cool. Send me your book when you have it." Like a novel is what they mean. So that's what happened, 2 or 3 people contacted me from great agencies, and they said, "We saw your story, we want to know what you're working on." And I said, "Well, I have a bunch of stories." And they were like, "Oh, cool, when you have a novel, let us know." But one person did not say that, and she was at William Morris Endeavor, which is mostly a kind of Hollywood thing, they're out there doing music and movie talent, but they also have a literary office in New York. And there was this one young agent there named Claudia, and she said, "I want to work with you." And I said, "Well, I just have a bunch of stories." She said, "I don't care, I want to see the stories." So I sent her the stories, and in that batch of stories, there were 2 insomnia stories, just 2. And she called me and she said, "We got to work on this. We got to make this a book all about an insomnia epidemic." And she said she'd represent me, and I said, "Okay." I didn't know how it worked. I thought there was a contract and everything, and I actually asked for one. She was like, oh, okay. They wrote one for me, but I didn't sign it. It's just like a verbal agreement that you have that she's going to represent me until she tells me she's not representing me, or I can always switch too. So that's what happened. Then I worked on the book for 4 years. And I worked with her. I thought I was done after like 2 years. And I'd send it to her, and they would pass it around William Morris, and they'd give me notes. And then I would get super pissed and pout for like a month. And then I would take it out, and I would start revising if I agreed with them or, disagreeing. And that's how it went until about November of last year, so 2 Novembers ago. She just said, "I think it's ready, I'm going to send it out." And so she did, and she sent it on a Thursday, and by Monday we had offers. And then it took all the way from then until March 4th for it to actually come out. Mostly it's just writing. I have other stories and stories coming out this spring in other journals. It's just It's just how it works. You've got to write a lot, and you've got to send it out, and you've got to take the hits, and not be discouraged, and just keep doing it, you know. I don't think it's in me. I don't think it's just like really, you know, kind of like work ethic or determination. I just feel like I cannot stop writing stories. It's just I can't stop. So it's not like, oh man, you're so disciplined. I just can't stop. I saw a thing on Facebook that said writers are people that have homework for the rest of their lives. And it's true. Well, all artists do. You go home, you can't just sit there and watch The Voice, even though I want to. You feel guilty. You feel like I should be writing. You turn it off, and you start to write. Yeah?
So is it like other forms of art that once you get recognized, that it's easier to get recognized again? In other words, is it kind of a cultural, once you're accepted, it's easier to get stories published, it's easier to be noticed?
I think it is. I think that's true. But I do think that stories... I think for people to put stories in journals or magazines, it has to be pretty solid. But I do think that the more publications and awards you have, the more they're inclined to give it a shot. And I think there are people far more accomplished and famous that people will probably take anything from them and publish it. Especially young journals that are trying to make a name for themselves, and they just approach. And I've seen it. They approach like George Saunders or Amy Bender or people like that, and they say, just give us anything you have. Or Rick Moody. I have a friend who just published Rick Moody in a little quarterly that they made themselves. It just brings some prestige to the journal. But yeah, also, since I have this book published, I can sell a book now on 100 pages rather than having to have the whole book, which is different. Before it was like, and I also have these people who publish this, which is Hogarth, which is an imprint at Crown Random House. They have the first right of refusal, I think it was what it's called. So they have to see it first. And that's just cool. It's cool to know that someone who can make this kind of decision is going to read it. And I have 130 so pages of the next book, but I'm not going to give it to them yet. I'm going to wait till it starts to arc a little more. But it's a little easier. Yeah.
My question is about the writing process itself. I found the book dark and challenging and uncompromising. So I'm wondering, after living mentally in that world for years, if you found that psychologically or emotionally difficult or challenging.
People have commented that the book is, kind of really relentlessly dark and grim. And most of you know me.
I didn't say grim.
Others have. I'm not that kind of person, I don't think. I don't feel that it's that dark or that it's really hopeless in some ways. I think what I did, because I feel removed from that feeling. And I think people read it and they think, wow, this is, what a miserable dude, I don't think I'm miserable. I think what I did is I got inside the moment with the situation, and I tried to come up with events that were surprising and worked outside of the genre expectations, but were truthful to the moment. And those things that came to me happened to be pretty dire. And I do think, I guess I do have some doubts about how like an entire society or culture could respond to such a thing. And I think those, I was talking about this with my students the other day. We were asking each other the question, why are these dystopian books, these books about the collapse of society and the end of the world, why are they so popular? Because there's a flood of them, I think for me, when I saw what happened in New Orleans, during Katrina, I was astonished that there wasn't more of a presence there. We saw the thinness of our resources, and the thinness of our response, and racism as well. To let that city flounder the way it did, I think was a horrifying thing to see. And I think it triggered in me this awareness that we really couldn't respond to a disaster like this very well. Beyond a couple of metropolis areas, it would be very difficult. So I just tried to play it from a realistic vantage point. I didn't find it to be, I wasn't seeking out more naturalistic or dark avenues. I just felt like those were plausible places the story could go while still sidestepping, kind of like superhero nonsense where there's someone who's going to solve all this and put it all together and everyone's going to be saved, which I'm just not interested in that kind of story. So I didn't feel while I was writing it that I was miserable or in a dark place. It didn't have any kind of spell on me. I felt like I could turn it off and on when I needed to and, do other things. So I guess it's compartmentalized in some way, that it's just happening on the page and not so much in my outlook of things or my attitude. Lynn.
So, what sparks inspiration? Do you go out and find it? Does it just hit you? I'm sure the answer is both, but I'm just curious about inspiration, because you do have this drive to, as all artists do, like, we gotta do what we have to do. So what sparks that? What sparks an idea? Do you go seeking, or does it come find you, or both, or?
I remember a time when I was keeping a notebook and I would hear things or see things and I would note them. And I don't do that so much right now. I feel like I have a backlog of ideas I want to get to. And when I have time, I get to them, I try them, and if they seem to take on a kind of life of their own, then I run with it. I think I'm just always compelled to tell stories. Just tell stories, one way or another, visually, whether it's film or with design or with text or with some combination of the two. And so I'm constantly devouring stories, whether it's reading or TV or film or whatever. And, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't know if the world really needs more stories or another book, but it's just kind of what happens. It's the way I'm wired, I think, for some reason. So I just, I have a long list of ideas that I try to get to, or I feel like there's some heat or some kind of glow around an idea that I'm drawn to, and then I keep playing with it, and it becomes something. A lot of times, nothing comes of it. A lot of times I sit down and work on stuff, and it's just not happening. Or I pillage it later for some kernel of an idea that might work, but it's not working in that piece. Right now what I'm doing, it's strange, I'm going back to older stories that are failures. I have a lot of them. And I'm salvaging them, and I can fix them. And I don't know why I can now suddenly fix them. I just think I'm more ruthless with them. You know that phrase, kill your darlings? I just slaughter them. Slaughter these darlings. So I don't hold on to things. I'm not emotionally attached to things as much as I were. I think I was trying to prove something to myself earlier, and that isn't so much there. So I can step away from ideas and feel confident that when I come back to it, it'll be there. I don't know if that makes sense. But now I am going through older stories that have something to them, something that worked that I couldn't do for whatever reason, and I'm making them work. And they're finding homes, in magazines and journals. So, and I watch a lot of stuff. I try to keep myself constantly stimulated by art, or stimulated by storytelling, or stimulated by visuals. So I am constantly online looking at things, and they could be photographs, they could be design, they could be paintings. I go to museums and roam around and get all fired up and run home and fall asleep. But sometimes I actually work. But I try to do that. I read stories. Sometimes I don't read whole books. I just pull a book off the shelf. I have lots of books, and I just take a hit off of it almost. Like it's just a shot. And I just read a paragraph or two, and I feel it inspire me. It's like you can feel the heat, like from a shot of vodka. It warms you, and you want to work. I do that a lot, and so I don't end up finishing a lot of books, but taking bites out of them, just to feel like I need to know what that channel of expression is about. I hope that answers that question.
I imagine you could have selected a number of conditions for the vehicle for the book. And why did you choose insomnia? And what did you have to learn about insomnia in order to make it work as such an integral part of the story?
Well, the insomnia was a real issue in my life because my longtime partner couldn't sleep very well. So it became more and more of something I observed. But I also had a lot of friends who were struggling with sleep. And it just is one of those things on the radar. It's like, wow, this is a thing. You know, like people are taking a lot of sleeping pills. People are taking, you know, they're trying to listen to like nature CDs at night, and they're buying white noise machines. And like, wow, what if, you know, it's all about what ifs. Especially these kind of, you know, sci-fi-ish type of approaches. You just see a situation and you extrapolate. You push it to the extremes and say, what kind of narrative would that create? You know, so it could be anything. Like for example, I have a story coming out soon that I hope a lot of you read, and it's about, this will be interesting, I think. It's about the end of higher learning. It's about colleges going under. It's about people trying to start rebuilding education. You know, that's a thing you see everywhere. You see this conversation everywhere. We have this conversation. You know, I just extrapolate on that. What if, you know, really, anything but just the Ivy League schools went under? You know, what would happen? Well, how would we rethink this? So that's a story that's coming out in Post Road, which is Boston College's journal. Will come out in a couple weeks, I think. So insomnia was interesting to me. Sleep is interesting to me. I'm a really good sleeper. Like I'm the opposite of an insomniac. And it was an interesting dynamic that I had at home. But I think sleep is really fascinating. You know, the research that I did was, you know, I Googled, and I talked to a couple of like, you know, sleep and brain people, but like, you know, in a kind of cocktail party type of sense. Not like I sat down and interviewed them, but just, hey, what would happen if, you know, we put an electrode in a guy's head? And they're like, yeah, you could do that. You know, but I didn't want it to be too real, you know, too scientifically plausible. You know, I think that starts to become a cage. Reality and facts are kind of annoying. Yeah.
That was a segue into my question, which is about research and how much kind of outside research did you do about, say, brain surgery or some of the other things that are kind of more scientific in the book, even just from the passages you read, and did you reach out to reality to, you know, to kind of ground you in what you were writing or not?
You know, like I said, I just watched some YouTube videos of brain surgery. They were really cool, kind of gruesome. I talked to some, you know, scientist types. I had an email exchange with a couple. I read stuff. I watched a couple of, you know, real Nova type documentaries about sleep research. And I guess that's really about it. I mean, I didn't want it to be too scientific. What I found, though, is that there's a lot of difference in the opinion about what sleep is and why we sleep. So sleep has its own built-in mystery, you know? It's its own metaphor. It has its own kind of poetic vagueness to it. No one really can say what it's, oh, sure, yeah, we're resting, but why? Why do we need to rest? Why not just design a machine, a human machine, an animal that doesn't need rest? Why do we need to do it? You know, there's a lot of different theories about why. So some of them are articulated in the book. But I don't want to get too into research. You know, research is, it's a different kind of writer, I think, than I am. I like making stuff up. Any more questions? You guys have had it? You're done with me? Just throw me out. Yeah, I guess it's about time to wrap it up. What's this?
This is a raffle.
I thought it was a salad. Pick three?
Did all the students get a chance to fill out a raffle slip?
So there's...
Hold on 1 second, we're going to get a...
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, make sure the students have a chance. Yeah. I didn't do the book cover. There are two book covers. There's one in the UK that I love, and they showed me that one first. It's a big owl eye, and I just loved it. And so I said to the US people, well, hey, why don't we just use that? And they said, oh no, we've got our own. And then a few weeks later, they showed me this, and I loved it. I love it. I think it pops. You know, I think it looks like it stands out on the shelf. And it's type. You know, it's mostly a type treatment. And I think it's great. All right, here we go. Here we go. We're doing 3 of these? Okay, here's the first one. Sean Ridley. Yeah, Sean. You got it. All right, here's the next one. Put this one back. No. Alex Turner. Oh. You all right?
Yeah, you know, I can walk around in peace.
Okay, here's one. Sam Mackey, or Smacky. That's what I call her. Cool. 3 of my students. It's great. Wonder why they're here. Because I made them. We are able to sell some books here if anyone's interested. I'm also willing to, if you care, I can sign it. But I really, really want to thank you for coming and for you guys for putting this together. Allison made this incredible display. You guys should see. It's like Pirates of the Caribbean, or, you know, it's Disney-esque in scale and scope. So thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it.